Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCullum, and today we are taking a look at a Dutch Beaumont rifle. This is actually a rather unusual version of a Beaumont to find for a couple reasons. First off, this is an 1871/79 pattern, and it is a single-shot rifle. That's how virtually all the Beaumonts were originally made, but it's very difficult to find one in that configuration today, because most of them, almost all of them, were converted to box magazine feeding. So we'll talk about that at the end of the video, but that's part of the reason that I'm really excited to have this one here, is because it's still in its single shot configuration. The other thing that makes it really neat is that it has this very cool Lion of Judah stamping on it, which I will also show you in a moment, which is indicative of ownership by the Kingdom of Ethiopia. This is in fact a rifle that came back, was imported into the US by Interordnance/Royal Tiger Imports. It came out of Ethiopia and is actually in remarkably good condition. I did spend a little time cleaning this up. These rifles were originally originally made and adopted in the white. When they were converted to magazine feeding, then they were blued, but this one never was, and so it never was. And it remains in remarkably good shape for being approximately 150 years old and having spent much of its life, probably 120 years of its life, in Ethiopia. So let's start with the basics of the rifle itself. This is the first Dutch breech-loading metallic cartridge standard issue rifle. The Dutch government started looking for a more modern firearm, a breech-loading arm, in 1867. By the beginning of 1868, their infantry and marine services had started trials on a series of various foreign available rifles. They were looking at the Verndl, they were looking at the Peabody, which is essentially a Martini. They were looking at the Remington Kerr, and none of these quite did it. And the trial started in January. In March of 1868, a new rifle is presented to them by a Dutch citizen, a gentleman by the name of Edouard de Beaumont, and that is this rifle. This would, of course, end up winning the contract. I should say the Dutch actually kind of used the Snider as a stand-in, a Snider conversion. They didn't really like it. It had a big downside of being the same bore diameter as the original muzzle-loading rifles that it was converted from, and we're talking 17.5 millimeter, which is a massive bullet, which means it's not going to be going very fast, and it's not ballistically all that great. They wanted something high velocity and smooth bore for the day. Anyway, the rifle that Edouard de Beaumont presented to them has elements of a couple different designs to it. It's got elements of the Chassepot. It's got elements, interestingly, of the Mauser-Norris, which was the first rifle designed, presented by the Mauser brothers. I actually have a video on one of the very first prototype Mauser-Norris rifles, and if you go take a look at that one after seeing this, you'll definitely see some of those similarities. And then the third major element to this rifle is a interesting and kind of unique mainspring system that was invented by a guy named John Claes of Liege, Belgium. So there was some patent argument, litigation back and forth about this rifle. Ultimately, Beaumont was an arms dealer. He was a facilitator. He was the guy who put the deal together. Cloes, yes, patented and invented the mainspring system that went into the rifle. So, skip forward a little bit. This goes through testing. It does well. In 1870, King Willem II of Holland, of the Netherlands, formally adopts it as their new standard infantry rifle, and it is the model of 1871. Now, when they formally adopted it, they then went back to Beaumont and said, okay, we like it, we're adopting it, please give us 64,000 of them. Beaumont is a deal maker. He doesn't have a factory, so he turns around and he sends an order for 64,000 Beaumont rifles to, one of the big, effective, efficient, standard arms manufacturing conglomerates of the day. He sends it to the Saint-Étienne Arsenal in France. Well, we're talking 1871 now. The Saint-Étienne Arsenal is not particularly in a good position to be making rifles for export, thanks to the Franco-Prussian War. That doesn't work out so well. So Beaumont ends up moving his order to and giving it to a consortium of gunsmiths in Suhl, in Germany. They would end up providing about 31,500 rifles to the Dutch government through Beaumont. Another order, well, further production then takes place in Belgium, or in the Netherlands, The primary producer was a company called P. Stevens that made about 86,000 of these rifles, including this particular one, which you'll see in just a moment. And then there was another producer in the Netherlands by the name of JFJ Bar, who made about 28,000 more of them. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at what this rifle is, and also the interesting markings on it that indicate its Ethiopian heritage. So here is our basic action, single shot, bolt action. It has one locking lug, which is the root of the bolt handle, very much like a Chassepot. It cocks on open, as you just saw. So this is your striker. When it's cocked, it's back there. When it's fired, it moves forward. Recock it. Notice that there is no grasping surface here. If you have a failure to fire, you can't just recock the striker. You have to actually open the bolt handle to do that. If we open that up, we have just a flat loading tray. Really nothing going on in there. Now, I mentioned that this is an 1871/79 modification or update. The main element, there are two main elements of that update. And one of them is the removal of the original safety mechanism. So there is no safety on this. It's just a matter of, if you're not ready to fire, well, don't put a cartridge in it. However, the very first 1871 Beaumonts, up until 1878, were made with sort of a trigger-looking hook right here on this spring. And when you could rotate that hook up, and it would lock the bolt sort of in a half-open, half-closed position, in which it was sealed up from dirt, so you could have a cartridge in there and it would protect it, but it was impossible to release the striker. And so that was the safety system. But they decided that was, honestly, I don't know the exact motivation. They decided it was unnecessary or overly complicated or had some other problem that I'm not aware of, and they deleted it. After 1878, new production guns wouldn't have this spring on the receiver at all. The fact that this is here indicates that this was an earlier production gun that has been updated to the new pattern. Now, the other modification that was made at that time was a redesign of the rear sight, because they actually adopted a new version of the cartridge. So this fires, the original 1871s fired an 11.3 by 50 millimeter rimmed cartridge, and it's a bottlenecked cartridge. Relatively high velocity for its day. It fired a 375 grain bullet at about 1,330 feet per second. For you Europeans, that's 24.3 grams at about 405 meters per second. Well, in 1878, they designed a new version of the cartridge that had a lighter bullet and fired at higher velocity. So the new version, they lengthened the case by 2 millimeters, so it became 11.3 by 52, and they also changed the profile of the case. They changed the shaping of the neck, the shoulder of the cartridge. That new one, the velocity bumped up about 100 feet per second. It was 1,425 feet per second, but the bullet weight dropped to 336 grains. That's 21.8 grams at 435 meters per second. And that made the gun a little flatter shooting. Actually, it made it a lot flatter shooting. So they had to redesign the rear sight. This goes from 150 meters at the very bottom out to, when you put it all the way up like this, 1,800. Oh, I'm sorry. And it is just a friction-based sight. There are no notches, there are no catches, there's no spring. It's just this outside piece rubbing on the centered bar. I mentioned that this has indications of being a pre-1878 manufacture rifle. Well, here's one of them. This is a Roundel stamp in the stock that was put on there when the gun was actually accepted into Dutch military service. So it has the W for King Willem. It is dated 1876. And it is marked Maastricht, which is the city where the gun was actually inspected and approved for military service. If we look back here at the receiver, we can see another Maastricht marking. This was made by P. Stevens, as I mentioned, of Maastricht. And we have a date of 1876 on the barrel. And we also have that really cool Lion of Judah, which is a national emblem of Ethiopia that can be found on a variety of Ethiopian firearms, most of them much more modern than this. Like SIG KE7s machine guns can be found with that Lion of Judah marking on them. So it's a really well stamped mark. This isn't some crude field armorer marking. And this stamp was uniform on all of the examples of these rifles that I saw. Really, the only other marking of note is the serial number right there on top of the receiver. These were done in batches of 1,000 guns with letter prefixes, so this is K864. And then lots of the other parts are also serialized, including both pieces of the bolt. You'll notice on this one, the bolt head is mismatched, so this had the bolt head replaced at some point. Taking a quick glance down the rest of the barrel, we have a single barrel band with a bottom-mounted sling swivel. And then we have a nose cap out at the front. This is the correct Beaumont cleaning rod. Up until 1875, they had a slot in them. After 1875, they were solid, and they are also serialized. And this one, unfortunately, has a mismatched cleaning rod. But the cleaning rods are actually kind of unusual to find at all, so it's nice that this one actually has one. Now, what makes the Beaumont mechanically interesting is its mainspring. So let's go ahead and take this apart. First step is to remove the bolt head. This was a fairly common thing in the first generation, like black powder military cartridge rifles, where you had a screw that held the bolt and bolt head together. The Chassepot, well, the Chassepot and Gras are like that. The Mauser 1871 is like that. The Beaumont is like that. So there's our bolt head, and I can just pull the rest of the bolt assembly out. There's that. This, by the way, has our extractor. The extractor is dovetailed into the bolt head, and it runs in that track right there. So the bolt head never rotates. It just sits there, runs back and forth. We've got a good hefty firing pin there. You can see there the single sear notch on the back of the striker right there. And we have a sear right there in the back of the receiver. So that's what actually does the firing. And then we have a screw in the bolt handle. So I can take that out. And what's cool here is the Beaumont bolt has a V-spring in it to run the firing pin. The front of the bolt is a separate piece there. There is the V-spring that powers the firing pin. This whole thing is one solid assembly. If you look up close, there's a semicircular cutout there. That sits right here around the circumference of the firing pin behind this collar. And when the gun is cocked, this V-spring gets compressed, and when it's released, that leg of the V-spring kicks forward, pushes the firing pin forward with it, and fires the rifle. And the bolt assembly here is open to hold it. So it's gonna go in basically like that. Notice that the second piece of the bolt handle has this little wedge so that I can put that wedge right in there to help in reassembling the rifle and compressing that spring back down. So this is rather unusual in that it is a bolt-action rifle with no coil springs in it anywhere. Now, that would also, that has a couple of downsides to it. A bunch of countries tested the Beaumont and decided not to adopt it because they were concerned that the V-spring was potentially fragile or would lose some of its strength over time. It was a system that was used by a couple other countries, most notably the Japanese Marathas have a bolt system just like this. Put our bolt head in there as well. The other downside to it is the Dutch actually could not make a bent bolt, like cavalry carbine version of the Beaumont, because you can't bend this bolt handle down because you've got a spring in it. So instead, the Dutch actually purchased Remington Rolling Black carbines for their cavalry and relegated this to just the infantry. Now I want to talk about this rifle's use in Ethiopia as well as in the Netherlands. So we'll start with the Netherlands. This is the 1879 pattern. In 1888, there was a major upgrade done to most of these rifles, and that is the conversion to a Vitali box magazine system. This held 4 cartridges, and it's kind of a funky looking, not your typical square magazine. It's got some interesting curvature to it. You may recognize Vitali from Vetterli Vitali because the Italians also used Vitali's patented magazine system to convert their single-shot Vetterlis into repeating rifles. So you have the Beaumont and the Vetterli, and then you have the Beaumont Vitali and the Vetterli Vitali. The Italians would then continue on further to convert their Vetterli Vitalis into Vetterli Carcanos in 1915. The Dutch did no such thing. There was no further upgrade of these after 1888. Anyway, that's what happened to them in the Netherlands. Now, as far as this rifle ending up in Ethiopia, we know that this particular example, and by extension all of the ones that went to Ethiopia, were Dutch surplus guns, because they have that wooden stamp, that stamp in the stock that indicates that they were accepted into Dutch military service. However, they were sent down there prior to or in lieu of any conversion to Vitali box magazines. And it appears that because of the quality and the uniform nature of that Lion of Judah stamp, this almost certainly was a deal that was done by a professional arms dealer in probably Belgium, would be my guess, possibly in the Netherlands, but a lot of this sort of business took place in Belgium. This is probably a dealer who bought the guns surplus from the Dutch army and then resold them to any client that he could find, in this case, Ethiopia, Menelik in particular, in Ethiopia. Now, I found a totally unsourced and thus totally unsubstantiated reference to a major purchase of arms by Ethiopia right after the Battle of Ottawa, which was 1896, specifically referencing both antique, like obsolete at that point arms, as well as modern arms. And what that, in theory, should reference would be the modern arms being smokeless powder things, probably Mausers and Mannlichers. The antique obsolete guns would have been the single-shot black powder type rifles like this. So there's no specific indication that this was sold to Ethiopia specifically in 1896 or 1897, but that seems to be the implication. And it would certainly fit with all the rest of the context surrounding Ethiopia and surrounding these guns, that would certainly be a period when these rifles would be on their way out of the Dutch military. In the 1890s, the Dutch military would adopt a smokeless powder turn-bolt Mannlicher rifle instead. So that's when they started getting rid of Beaumonts. Little other contextual information, the 1871 pattern Beaumont like this was never actually used in a major European conflict. The Dutch didn't actually use it in any war themselves. They did use some Beaumonts. There were 1873 pattern Beaumonts that are slightly different, that we'll cover on another day, that were used in Dutch colonial service in the West Indies, or in the East Indies, the Dutch East Indies. Those saw combat use, but these never did. The Dutch didn't find themselves in a war during their armament, their period of being armed with 1871/79 Beaumonts. Anyway, hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.